Now we're going to shift our focus back to the Great Plains, and we are going to introduce some new players in the U.S. Army in that setting.
Including this guy, George Armstrong Custer of Michigan, who at this point in time, 1868, was a lieutenant colonel in command of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Now, you've probably heard of Custer, but he's always referred to as General Custer. You never hear anyone talk about Lieutenant Colonel Custer. And there's a reason for that. Not that he became a general later, because he didn't, but that he had been a general before, during the Civil War. It was what is known as a brevet rank, also pronounced brevet, although actually it's a French word, so it really should be pronounced brevet. Anyhow, I'm going to say brevet for the sake of brevity. A brevet rank is not an official rank. It's kind of like an unofficial temporary rank. It's what happens when there's a war going on and there are a lot of officers being killed, which was certainly the case in the Civil War, and really quickly you have to promote people up the ranks because you have to have someone in charge that might not, technically have been in their previous rank long enough to really officially get promoted. So in Custer's case, he was in the cavalry also during the Civil War, and he made his way up through several brevet ranks until he had the brevet rank of Brigadier General, which is a 1-star general, at the age of 23, making him the youngest general in the Union Army. And he distinguished himself, he distinguished himself already to have advanced that far, plus the fact that so many of his superior officers were getting killed didn't hurt, but he particularly performed well during the Battle of Gettysburg. And so he became kind of a Civil War hero, really, which is the sort of thing that at the age of 23 is pretty heady stuff. Now, his brother is pictured there, Tom Custer. Tom was 5 years younger than George, and he also served in the same Michigan cavalry outfit with his older brother, and in fact was Custer's, eventually Brigadier General Custer's aide during the Civil War. Toward the end of the war, Tom Custer, who had also had several brevet rank advances, right before, a couple of weeks really before the end of the war, he performed particularly admirably on the battlefield and won the Congressional Medal of Honor, which, is a great honor, obviously. And then, 3 days later, he won it again. He had 2 medals of honor, one of only 4 people during the Civil War to do that, and one of only 19 people in American history to have won 2 medals of honor. Well, older brother George, he was a hero, but he didn't have 1 Medal of Honor, let alone 2. And I've always wondered if maybe the fact that his younger brother, who was his aide, in essence his assistant, got 2 Medals of Honor and he didn't get any, if that may have played into some of his ambition later on in his career when he really was a glory hound. I'm sure there was some of that already. But I've always wondered if maybe that didn't help speed that along. So Tom Custer, at the end of the war, after he won those 2 medals, he got the brevet rank of lieutenant colonel. So here you've got, at that time, you've got Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer. This is 1865, 25 years old, and his aide, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Custer, age 20. So that was some rapid advancing. However, when the Civil War was over, the U.S. Army following a long-established tradition at that point of almost 90 years since the Revolution. When a war was over, most of the army was disbanded, leaving only basically a skeleton crew until the next war came along, at which point they would really quickly try to get a bunch more volunteers. There was not a standing peacetime draft to supplement the numbers. So what that meant was, even though there were an enormous amount, I'm not even sure what the number was, hundreds of thousands at least, of people serving in the United States Army. Once the war was over, almost all of them went home. So many of the ones who decided to stay in were the ones who wanted to make a career out of it. And if they were officers, well, that's a little bit more attractive of a career, really, than being a private, although there were some enlisted soldiers who stayed in as well. But thing is, you have to have a whole lot of soldiers to justify having a whole lot of officers. So all those brevet promotions, those battlefield promotions, they were temporary, and so they were no longer in effect. And people were reduced down to what their rank would have been if not for having to quickly replace killed higher officers. So that by 3 years after the end of the Civil War, George Armstrong Custer, by that point, where we are now, 28 years old, a former brigadier general, but now a lieutenant colonel, and his younger brother, Tom, 5 years younger than him, former lieutenant colonel, now captain. So these two guys, obviously, are going to be entering into our story soon and will be in the story later on as well. Also serving in the West at this time, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, who came to be known as the Buffalo Soldiers. There were a lot of cavalry regiments serving out in the West, but these two in particular were different than the others. They were the all-black cavalry troopers. The Army was segregated and had been since before the War of 1812. A lot of these soldiers had served in the Union Army in segregated units during the Civil War. The troopers were black, but the officers, all the officers at first, were white, and many of the top sergeants at first. Over time, the non-commissioned officers were all black, and then there started to be a few junior officers over time who served with these regiments. There were also 2 infantry regiments that were all black that were serving in the West, the 24th and 25th Infantry. Now, the name Buffalo Soldiers was given to them by the Cheyenne for a couple of reasons. Number one, because of their dark skin and their curly black hair made them physically reminiscent of buffalo to the Cheyenne. But it wasn't meant as an insult. It was meant actually as an honor. They fought against the Cheyenne, but comported themselves very well and were brave and just kind of kept coming. And so that name, Buffalo Soldiers, stuck with them well after the fighting in the West had subsided. But they're going to enter into our 1860s, late 1860s narrative and later on as well.
As I mentioned, there were also 2 regiments of Buffalo Soldier infantry, the 24th and 25th. So that's 4 regiments in all. Now, during the Civil War, there had been about 180,000 black soldiers in the U.S. Army from various places. However, the Army was downsized after the war, as previously mentioned. So we went from 180,000 black soldiers to between 3,000 to 4,000 probably in these 4 regiments, which would be in operation all the way through the rest of the 19th and into the early 20th century.
Also, let us introduce this guy, General Philip Sheridan, who was, he was kind of a short fella. To his friends, he was known as Little Phil. General Sheridan, during the Civil War, had reached the rank of Major General. That's 2 stars. And by 1868, he still had them. He had been one of Grant's top generals. He was a cavalry general during the war, and a cavalry general now in the West. He had been sort of the equivalent of president, or not president, but general at that time, General Grant's equivalent to Robert E. Lee's Jeb Stuart, so far as being like one of the top cavalry commanders. Now he has been assigned to take charge in this part of the West, in the southern plains that we're looking at, in part because there had been an increase in raids in the summer of 1868, actually from 67 up into 68, after the signing of that treaty that, remember, the Dog Soldiers didn't go along with. So they had continued making raids into Colorado and in Kansas, and in fact, over the course of the previous year, from summer of 67 to summer of 1868, 79 civilians had been killed by Indian raids. At the same time, the Comanches, particularly the Coahati Comanches, who also had not agreed with that treaty, they were making raids in Texas, and in some cases, the Southern Cheyenne and the Comanches were assisting one another, and there were still some Southern Arapahoes and some individual Lakota who had joined up with them. So a lot of raiding going on, and that had stepped up by early August. So on August the 10th, Sheridan came in to take over the situation and try to pacify these Indians who were going on raids. In addition to having at his disposal the 7th Cavalry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry and several other regiments, General Sheridan also decided to try something different. There was an officer that was Sheridan's aide, Major George Forsyth, known by the nickname Sandy to his friends, who had actually at this time was holding the brevet rank of lieutenant colonel. And there he is in a photograph sometime after this, not very long after this, when he had the brevet rank of brigadier general. So he's got the 1 star there. But at this time, he is officially a major, serving as a brevet lieutenant colonel and as aide to Sheridan. Sheridan gave him an assignment. He gave him the assignment to form a squad of civilian scouts. And the idea was civilian scouts didn't have to operate necessarily under military rules and regulations. So this essentially was meant to be like a guerrilla group outside of the regular way of doing things. And he asked that Forsyth go out and recruit some men that were hardy frontiersmen. And their goal was to take the fight to the Indians using the Indians' tactics, not regular army tactics. Well, Forsyth chose as his second in command Lieutenant Frederick Beecher. Forsyth, by the way, was assigned to the 9th Cavalry. Lieutenant Beecher was, they were both young men. I think Beecher was maybe 23, 24 years old. Forsyth was in his late 20s, actually roughly equivalent, the same ages as the Custer brothers. Beecher had performed heroically at the Battle of Gettysburg, so despite their youth, these were battle-hardened Army veterans, although not battle-hardened necessarily in fighting Native Americans. So they did, in fact, they recruited 48 civilian scouts. And this guy on the right is one example of the type of guy that they got. Jack Stillwell, who would later be known as Comanche Jack, at this time was only 18 years old. This photograph was taken when he was about 22 or 23, a few years later. So he was a civilian. All the civilians were equipped with Spencer rifles, right? Remember us discussing how much of an advantage that gave over even the single-shot breech-loading Springfields. So a little more firepower. You could shoot 7 times before you had to reload. So these guys set off to try to find some of the Native American bands who had been conducting raids along the Sabine and Solomon rivers. And in fact, they referred to themselves informally as the Solomon Avengers. Several civilians, settlers had been killed. Like I said, the raids had stepped up. So off they went in search of some Indians. Gee, I wonder if they'll find any. Spoiler alert, they found some Indians. Now, at this time, General Sheridan had given orders, and the 9th and 10th Cavalry were patrolling just south of Beecher Island, which you can see there in the map on the red. They were in West Kansas. Beecher Island is just across the border into Colorado. It wasn't called Beecher Island at the time. It wasn't called anything. It didn't have a name. It was just a big sandbar in the middle of this not very big river. And we'll look at a photo of it in a moment. But anyway, you had the Buffalo Soldiers there south of that place, and then the 7th Cavalry was south of them. And Forsyth scouts were sent to try to catch a band of about 25 Indians who had attacked a rail station in western Kansas. So they trailed them into Colorado there, and Forsyth and his men made camp along the southern bank of the Arikara River and made camp for the night, and did not realize that they had made camp just 12 miles from not just the 25 Indians they were after, but a huge encampment that was comprised of 2 Oglala Lakota villages and 1 Cheyenne Dog Soldier village and several lodges of Arapaho warriors, all together in one encampment, several hundred people. The Indians were aware of Forsyth before Forsyth was aware of them, but he became aware of them at dawn the next day, of September the 17th, 1868. The combined force of Indians attacked, led by Roman Nose, the Cheyenne leader, and they were going to just sweep over them while they were in camp there on the bank of the river. And they might well have massacred them if that had happened. Unfortunately, discipline did not hold, and a handful of warriors couldn't wait for the signal and rushed in early and gave themselves away, so that there was time for the alarm to be raised among the scouts. So what Forsyth and his men did was took their horses and waded into the river and went to that sandbar to defend themselves, and pretty soon there were several hundred warriors descending upon them. I say several hundred, not a specific number, because there are, like in a lot of these battles, varying accounts, ranging from, some people said 200, some said 600, some said as many as 1,000. So several hundred, that's a safe guess. When you've only got 50 guys on your side, doesn't really matter if it's 500 or 600, ultimately. So they went there onto this little island where there was no cover. It's just a sandbar. And they killed their own horses the scouts did, killed their own horses so that they could hide behind them and use them for cover as the Indians swept in on them, coming at them from both sides of the river. Fortunately for the scouts, they had those Spencer repeating rifles, and with the minimal cover of their own dead horses, they were able to give a pretty good account of themselves, just like those other skirmishes that we talked about before. And in fact, Roman Nose was killed early on in this battle. Here's that photograph. As you can see, it's not a very big area. So you take 50 men and their dead horses and put them on that sandbar, and it pretty well would have covered just about every square inch. The Indians made several attempts just to charge at the island, but those, like I said, didn't work because of the concentrated firepower of those Spencer rifles. So they abandoned that tactic, and instead they took cover in the tall grass and acted as snipers, so that for the next several days, every time one of the scouts poked his head up above his dead horse, they would take a shot at him and sometimes hit him. And then at the same time, the scouts were doing the same thing to them. So the overall casualty rate here among the scouts was that 6 people died. One kind of lingered for a while before he passed on, and 15 people were wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant Beecher, the second in command, which is why they named this little island after him and why this is called the Battle of Beecher Island. The commander, Forsyth, was wounded twice. He was shot in the leg, shattering the bone, and he also got clipped on the forehead, which was not fatal, but the bleeding from those 2 wounds made it seem kind of touch and go as to whether he was going to make it for a while. So here they were, pretty well pinned down, with nothing to drink except whatever muddy water they could scoop up, and nothing to eat. And as they got hungrier, they eventually started cutting meat from their dead horses. And they really should have done that sooner, before they started rotting. By the time they got around to doing that, that meat was pretty foul. And the smell got pretty bad too. And they were pretty well, pinned down there and trapped right in the middle of all that rotting horse meat, which didn't help things. Eventually, Forsyth decided that someone needed to try to sneak away under cover of darkness and try to go for help. So 2 of the scouts volunteered to do that. Comanche Jack Stillwell and another guy about the same age as him, Pierre Avalanche Trudeau. Not the same Pierre Trudeau who would later become Prime Minister of Canada, a different one, this one known as Avalanche. So Comanche and Avalanche wrapped themselves in blankets, horse blankets, to try to disguise themselves as best they could in the moonlight to look like Indians, and they slipped into the water and swam to shore and crawled through the tall grass and made their way, it took several hours, made their way past the Indians, and then took off on foot, trying to find help, the whole time trying to avoid the various Native American patrol parties that were out in the area. And they spent 4 days doing that, avoiding Indians, until they finally reached the 9th Cavalry, who then came to the rescue. The cavalry came to the rescue of the scouts there on the island, and they arrived, and the native warriors retreated. Then they withdrew, and very quickly, the first thing, of course, they did was take these guys off that rotting, stinking little island, and tried to get them back to safety. The commander of the 9th Cavalry actually got the Medal of Honor for his actions in leading this rescue attempt. Custer and his 7th Cavalry, meanwhile, were farther to the south, still trying to catch some of those dog soldiers who were conducting so many raids. And they got on the trail of some of them, and it led them into western Oklahoma, into Indian Territory, and led them to a village along the Washita River. Now, the dog soldiers weren't in the village. They weren't from the village. They had passed through the village and continued going farther to the west. There were also a lot of other villages in the region along the upper Washita. This is where many of the tribes had gathered together for a winter encampment, including not far from this one village that Custer found. Just down the road, there was an Arapaho encampment led by Little Raven again. There was a Kiowa encampment not too far away that included the Kiowa leaders Kicking Bird, Lone Wolf, and Satanta, all of whom we'll be talking about more later. This particular village was led by none other than Black Kettle, who was the Cheyenne chief, who 4 years before this had been attacked by John Chivington at Sand Creek and had barely managed to get out with his life, him and his wife. His wife's name was Medicine Woman. And if you'll recall, they then relocated to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, where they were told they would be safe, just like they'd been told they would be safe at Sand Creek. So here they were, once again, exactly where they were told they were supposed to be in order to be safe. There were about 50 teepees, 50 lodges of Cheyenne families in this village, and there were a couple of lodges of Lakota and a couple of lodges of Arapaho. These were people who were just passing through and were visiting and stayed for a little while with the Cheyenne. There was also a Kiowa who was there with them. Well, Custer's men saw the village and decided to attack at dawn, and Custer divided his force into 4 parts to surround the village and come at it from every direction. Now, this is a tactic he would use again later, so remember that one. So here they come, galloping into this peaceful village of about 250 people total, at least half of whom were women and children. Some of the Cheyenne warriors were able to grab their weapons and try to take cover and put up some resistance, but it wasn't much of a resistance. A lot of people were killed, and the number varies widely. Again, like in a lot of these actions, some estimates go as high as about 150 out of the 250 people in the village, around half of whom were women and children. A lot of women and children were killed, and 53 women and children were captured and taken to a nearby fort and imprisoned in a stockade. Black Kettle, pictured here, and his wife were both shot in the back and killed as they were running away. There were some casualties on the other side. There were 13 troopers wounded from the 7th Cavalry and 21 killed, which looks like at least some resistance was put up, but how much resistance was it when you take into account how some of those troopers were killed? 21 were killed, and 20 of those died altogether in an action just outside the village, actually. So by the time the fighting had been going on for a little bit, Custer's Osage scouts informed him that, in fact, there were a bunch more villages all around, and probably about 6,000 Indians in all from all the different tribes we've been talking about. And again, they were there legally. That's where they were supposed to be. However, Custer quickly figured out, hey, this might not be a good idea to hang around now, and so he ordered an immediate withdrawal. They killed most of the Indians' horses, keeping enough to transport their prisoners. But a squad of 20 soldiers, led by Major Joel Elliott, went the other direction because they were chasing down some fleeing Cheyenne. And they chased after them, and Major Elliott was heard saying, "For a brevet or a coffin." In other words, I'm going to get promoted or I'm going to get killed, one or the other. And that's another one of those kind of like Fetterman things where, he called it. Because what happened was those 20 soldiers ran smack into a large force of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa from nearby villages who were rushing in, having heard the gunfire, to see what was going on and coming to the rescue, and they killed those 20 men. This would haunt Custer's reputation because he was accused by some in the press and by at least one of his own officers, Benteen, that we'll talk about later, who was pals with Elliott, of having in a cowardly fashion, abandoned those 20 men instead of going and getting them when they retreated. Nonetheless, the result was a lot of peaceful Indians who were not at war, including a lot of women and children, were killed, and this did not help relations with the Indians there in the area, especially again when Black Kettle was doing what he had been told to do. However, just like with Sand Creek, remember how the people of Denver reacted to that? They loved it. The newspapers were just full of accounts of the heroic bravery of George Armstrong Custer, and he regained some of his fame, the luster of which had faded since the Civil War, and even more so, he became a national celebrity for this brave and heroic action along the Washita River. Black Kettle, meanwhile, in my opinion, was one of the unluckiest people in American history. This incident, which took place in early winter under snowy conditions, is in fact the incident portrayed in the movie Little Big Man, the one where his village is massacred and his wife and child are killed. Now, at the time, and for a whole long time thereafter, this was referred to, and in some cases still is, as the Battle of the Washita. However, it's more accurately described as the Washita Massacre, and more historians are calling it that now. Also in November 1868, there was a presidential election, and the former commanding general of the Union Army, Republican Ulysses S. Grant, was elected and would take office in early 1869. He would be reelected in 1872. Now, this is not a U.S. history course, so we won't talk a whole lot about different presidential administrations. If you do know much about U.S. Grant, you'll know that he was a brilliant and incredible general, but he wasn't that great of a president. He wasn't that good at it, and his administration was just rife with scandal. Most of it not his immediate doing, but rather the fact that he was very unwise in who he put in charge and whom he trusted. But despite all that, when it comes to policies regarding American Indians, President Grant was one of, in fact, quite possibly, maybe even probably, the most pro-Indian president in the 19th century. He had a whole new approach, and his policy toward Indians was, as he put it, the peace policy. He believed that, quote, wars of extermination are demoralizing and wicked. He wanted to, wherever possible, be humane, and wherever possible, cut them some slack, as it were, which there hadn't been a whole lot of prior. And some things he did, some steps he took to move toward this, was that he changed how the Indian agent system worked. It was no longer a patronage system. That is, before, for someone to become a reservation agent, a government representative for Indians, it was usually a political reward for supporting some governor or senator or even president. And the people who were put in charge were not qualified, usually never experienced, and quite often very morally suspect. So instead of doing that, Grant made the change of making it his policy to put clergy in charge of the reservations, and wherever possible to make sure they were Quakers, because he felt that those were people that could be trusted to deal fairly with all sides. He also did something that was very different for that time. In his appointment to who was going to be the new Commissioner of Indian Affairs, he appointed this guy in the second photograph, Eli Parker. Eli Parker was a former brigadier general in the Union Army and had been on General Grant's staff during the Civil War. So far, how is that different? Well, he also was a member of the Seneca Nation, which is one of the Iroquois tribes. So he was a Native American. This means that Grant actually put an actual real American Indian in charge as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And it would be 100 years before that happened again. It would be 1968 before a Native American would be in charge of the government agency dealing with Native Americans. It has become kind of standard policy since then, but it was new at the time. Now, Grant appointed his top general in the Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman, to replace himself as being in command, overall command of the United States Army. And Phil Sheridan, Grant's former cavalry general, he now replaced Sherman as being in charge of the whole Department of the American West, where the military was concerned. Now, this is going to lead to some interesting things. You've got Grant, who is really trying to institute approaches that are going to lead to peace and trying to be reasonable and humane with the Indians. And immediately that led to fewer types of things like the Washita Massacre. But in charge of the military is William Tecumseh Sherman, who is best known for, during the Civil War, burning the South, engaging in total war, which is war specifically targeting civilians so as to completely and thoroughly demoralize and defeat the enemy. So those are two very different approaches. Now, Grant was behind that in the Civil War because he wanted to end that war. He and Sherman believing that would save more lives in the long run. But what this is going to translate into for the next 8 years is a president who wants to do the right thing, but when there is conflict, it's Sherman that's going to be in charge of deciding how to handle it. So I will leave it up to you to predict how that's going to work out.